I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who is a hometown person. She lives in Helena. She said she walked here today. Oh, you could. Sorry, she could have walked here, but she thought it was maybe a poor choice, given that it's still a little warm outside. And that is Stacy Montemayor, and she'll be speaking on Leadership Under Fire, a Black Montanan and the Nez Perce War of 1877.
Okay. All right. Is that volume okay? How about that volume? Okay, so in Montana history, the summer of 1877 is probably most well known for the Nez Perce War, which began after several bands of Nez Perce declined to move onto Idaho reservation land so as to make room for white settlers, or to sign a treaty that would ultimately be broken by the United States. Instead, they left for what was the Buffalo Plains in Montana Territory, a hunting ground where white people had historically been friendly with them. Complicating the journey was that as the U.S. Army pursued them, some of their young warriors had engaged in violence with white settlers. But by early August, more than 800 Nez Perce had reached Big Hole River, not far from present-day Wisdom, Montana. Here, the U.S. Army attacked at what would become known as the Battle of Big Hole. Although the U.S. Army lost the battle, the pre-dawn attack killed between 60 and 90 Nez Perce, with the majority of them being children, the elderly, and women. Grieving, in need of new supplies, and wanting to keep their distance from Fort Ellis, near Bozeman, the Nez Perce veered from their well-worn route to the plains and headed directly towards Yellowstone, where several groups of mostly white tourists were enjoying America's first national park. One of these groups was made up of 10 men from Helena, most of whom were not particularly experienced outdoorsmen. And when some newspapermen and then later historians wrote about this ill-fated tourist party, a black man was sometimes mentioned, but usually only identified as the party's cook, with no name given. This man, Benjamin Stone, was much more than the group's cook. He was a well-liked and well-connected man, and one of the only experienced outdoorsmen in the group. And in fact, he, along with two others, had been elected to lead this party into the park. When their party ultimately was attacked by young Nez Perce warriors, and as their tragedy unfolded in the park, Stone took his leadership role seriously and courageously helped. Stone was born in New York around 1833, the oldest of at least 4 boys. His mother, Margaret, worked doing domestic labor, and his father, John, originally from Washington, D.C., worked as a sailor. By his early 20s, Stone also was working as a sailor, and the family lived near the Hudson River in what's present-day Midtown Manhattan. After 1855, Stone's entire family disappears from the record, but he shows back up in December 1866 in Helena. He was a founding member of the Pioneer Glee Club, which was an all-black social club that sang and I think had fun mostly. Stone was essentially a Helena pioneer. Since at least the 1860s, Stone had been associates with and worked for outdoorsmen. Starting in 1869, he worked for Henry Washburn, the Surveyor General for the Montana Territory. He worked as a messenger for the former Congressman and Reconstruction-era Republican. And in 1870, Washburn led the second organized expedition of non-native people into what became Yellowstone National Park. That summer, Stone not only worked for Washburn and his 3 civil engineers, one of whom was his brother-in-law, but he also lived with them at their office on North Rodney Street right here in Helena. Stone undoubtedly was privy to countless planning details, as well as stories of the trip upon their return. These firsthand accounts must have been incredibly useful to Stone in the summer of 1877. Stone was also something of an outfitter, accompanying hunting and fishing parties into the wilds of Montana. And in fact, in October of 1876, he was on a trip with Montana's territorial governor, Benjamin Potts. They, along with a couple other prominent Helena men, were en route to the Judith Basin to hunt buffalo. But their coach overturned en route at Benton Gulch near the Smith River. The other men were unharmed. However, Stone's leg had been badly broken. It was later described as being maimed. They took him to the nearby Camp Baker, where he was bedridden for 2 weeks until his leg was healed well enough so that he could return home to Helena. The injury to his leg plagued Stone for the rest of his life, and in the summer of 1877, it hindered him as he fled the Nez Perce attack. Flash forward now, back to the summer of 1877, 4 days after the Battle of Big Hole. The group of Helena men set out for Yellowstone under the command of 3 men: Benjamin Stone, as well as Leslie Wilkie, an immigrant from Canada who worked in the Surveyor General's office, and Leonard Duncan, who was the owner of the Little Emma mine and a clerk here in town. The rest of the party was made up of Richard Dietrich, who was an immigrant from Breslau, Prussia. He was a much-liked music teacher here in Helena. Charles Kenck, an immigrant from present-day Germany. He owned the Washington Brewery, highlighted here in yellow. This is basically from the top of Broadway looking down towards present-day Park Ave. Another brewer in the party was August Fuller, who was a proprietor of the Union Brewery, which you can kind of see here on the top left, highlighted in yellow. Jack Stewart, I have no photos of, sadly. He was an immigrant from England, and he worked at the Helena Water Company. He might have actually been one of the owners, it's not clear to me. And then we have Frederick Pfister here on the right. He, at one point, was a furniture dealer. Joe Roberts, seated here on the left, he was the youngest of the party at the time at about 18 years old. And then the man in the middle, Andrew Weichert, we know the most about him because his journal from this trip was published 20 years later. And it's safe to say it was perhaps a little bit embellished when it was published. At any rate, the party set out on August 13th on horseback with additional supplies loaded onto 2 pack horses. As would be the pattern, the men traveled in 3 separate groups all the way down to Yellowstone, with the leader group made up of Stone, Wilkie, and Duncan taking the lead. The lack of experience and fitness of some of the men of this party was immediately made apparent, with horses getting loose, people falling off their horses, and Weichert's group not being able to find a creek at night and having to camp dry with no fish and no water. As would be the pattern, I said that. It took Weichert's group 8 days to make the roughly 200 miles to Mammoth Hot Spring, whereas the group of leaders, Stone included, they did it in about half that time. As Stone and the others waited for Weichert's group to arrive at Mammoth, Stone climbed the nearby Mount Everts, which you can see here in the background. It's the Plateau Mountain. Near the top, towards the southern end of the cliff, which would be on the right there, he carved his name, Ben Stone, 1877, into a soft layer at the foot of this cliff. It was still there more than 70 years later. At about the same time, Weichert's group, still en route to Yellowstone, encountered none other than William Tecumseh Sherman, who was leaving the park. He was, at that time, the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Army. Sherman's group had been on a tour of military posts throughout the West, and they had just gone through Yellowstone when they had learned of the Battle of Big Hole. Sherman knew the battle had been a disaster for the U.S. Army and that the Nez Perce had veered off their typical route to the plains and were last seen headed towards Bannock. On August 18th, Sherman and his men spoke with Weikert's party for about 20 minutes, exchanging news. Dietrich gave Sherman the latest newspapers they had, and Sherman's aide-de-camp, Colonel Orlando Metcalf Poe, reported that they gave what information they had concerning the movements of the Nez Perce, as well as some suggestions concerning their proposed tour. Poe's name might be familiar to some of you from the burning of Atlanta. We only know about this encounter, though, because it was buried in Sherman's 83-page inspection report from this tour of the West. Incredibly, Weikert's party was a group of mostly Northern Union men who had just run into two iconic Union heroes, yet no one mentioned meeting them in interviews or in their diaries. It makes me wonder if Sherman's group hadn't encouraged caution or even foregoing their pleasure trip altogether. And then later, after the Helena party was attacked, perhaps they were reluctant to admit that they had been warned. Just a guess. At any rate, the whole Helena party was finally assembled at Mammoth. And on the very first morning together, a squabble erupted when Dietrich, the top right gentleman, our music teacher, he refused to share in his duty of the camp chores. Because of this spat, we know that prior to leaving Helena, the men had all agreed that they would share both cooking duties and camp chores. It reveals that Stone was not on this trip simply as the cook, and it seems instead that he was frequently, but not always, responsible for preparing the substantial midday meal, but that was it. All other chores and cooking duties were the responsibility of the entire group. To illustrate this point, on the day of the squabble, it was young Roberts who stayed back at camp to prepare dinner while everyone else went off to fish. Squabbles aside, the men soon set off, and on the 25th, they set up camp near Sulphur Mountain. By this time, the Nez Perce had been in the park for 2 days. The leaders had wanted to avoid trouble with any white people. However, some of the younger men were eager for retribution after their losses at Big Hole, and they had already attacked another tourist party from Raidersburg. Duncan was out on a wander when he came tearing back into camp with the news that he had spotted something on the other side of the Yellowstone River. Once they had deduced that it was the Nez Perce, the group held a council. Kenk and Duncan wanted to head home as quickly as possible, but the majority wanted to continue on so that they could see the geysers. This decision would prove fatal for some of their party. Nervous at the proximity of the Nez Perce, they pulled up camp and traveled north to Sulphur Springs. Kenk told the rest of the party that he was going to ride on as fast as he could, and he took off, eventually making camp at a spot they had stayed 2 days prior near the falls. The remaining men made much slower progress, and they eventually made camp at a beautiful spot on a high ridge above where Otter Creek forked, a bit above the upper falls. It's the section in blue here is Otter Creek. And just to orient you, directly to the right is Upper Falls, and if we went south a little bit, we would run into Lake Yellowstone. The men were more at ease at their camping spot, believing themselves to be well hidden. Nevertheless, that evening, Wilkie set out on horse to scout their surroundings. He returned to camp at about 10 p.m. with Kenk. When everyone had failed to arrive at Kenk's camp, he decided to turn back and look for them. He had very little difficulty locating his friends because he had seen the smoke from their campfire. Essentially, they were so easy to locate that a man who brewed beer for a living was able to track them. Group leader Duncan was still not at ease, and he slept a half mile into the woods that night, while everyone else stayed at camp and continued to feed their fire. After breakfast the next morning on August 26th, Stuart encouraged Kenk, the only married man in the group, to take 2 horses and make haste back to Helena. But Kenk declined, saying he would stay with the group. Who's to say that he did this out of a sense of camaraderie or because he didn't want to be on his own? But either way, this decision sealed his fate. He would be dead in a few hours, leaving behind his wife Leah and their 2 young children. After breakfast this morning, Wilkie and Weichert left on another scouting mission where they would ride right into a Nez Perce ambush. Weichert was shot in the shoulder, but incredibly, they managed to escape. Back at camp, still waiting around for their friends to return, the men continued to burn their campfire all morning long. Around noon, Pfister wandered into the woods in search of more firewood so that he could cook their lunch. Instead of cooking, Stone was telling stories around the campfire, and he had so many of them laughing that Kenk, who had been over at his sleeping spot reading, was drawn back to the crowd, to the group, and asked Stone what he had everyone laughing about. And just as Stone was repeating what he said, shots rang out. Still in the woods, Pfister heard the crack of gunfire from a dozen rifles and the hollers of men on horseback. He looked back towards the camp and saw their group had been ambushed by Nez Perce. Duncan, the first to comprehend what was happening, took off running, and others quickly followed suit, fleeing in all directions. Stone ran as best he could down a hillside towards Otter Creek. His leg injury from the prior year hindered him as he fled, and unable to navigate the steep grade, he took a tumble, somersaulting several times until he landed near the creek at the bottom of the hill. He looked up to see a Nez Perce scout 50 feet from him. The rider fired on Stone and came so close to actually striking him that Stone later discovered a bullet had torn a hole in the seat of his trousers. While being fired upon, Stone rolled over into the frigid creek and stayed that way for hours. Cold and hurt in the shallow water of Otter Creek, deep in the heart of America's first national park, Benjamin Stone played dead, and it saved his life. Along another stretch of the creek, Dietrich also lay in the water for hours, hidden by tall grass. Pfister, who had been in the woods collecting firewood, eventually ran into Lieutenant Schofield's camp near Tower Falls. Understanding the proximity of the Nez Perce and that they were underprepared for a confrontation, they quickly pulled up camp and hurried towards Mammoth. During the attack, Stewart was shot just above his ankle, and then another shot later hit his hip. The scouts approached Stewart, who was bleeding profusely on the ground, and he begged for his life. He surrendered money and a silver watch, and they let him live, likely thinking probably he was going to die. During all of that, Kenk was also chased and ultimately killed by a shot in the back of his neck. Duncan was pursued into the woods, but he evaded detection, and after dark, he and Dietrich left on foot towards Mammoth Hot Springs, where they thought they could find safety. The 2 younger men of the party, Roberts and Fuller, ran as a rider unloaded a repeating revolver at them. They escaped to the west and eventually arrived in Virginia City 5 days later. Hours after the attack, Stone finally got up from the creek. He made it less than 50 feet before collapsing in the spot where his hat lay. He was exhausted, his old leg injury was hurting horribly, and he was only able to walk a short distance before collapsing again. He eventually picked his way through the timber and found their camp from a few days prior, where he ate some discarded food. Then he struck out towards Mammoth. After the dust had settled, the injured Stewart washed his wounds in the creek and then managed to make his way back to their Otter Creek camp. He was able to eat some bread and ham, and then he too left Mammoth but he soon ran into his mare, Nellie. Between his injuries and Nellie having no saddle, he had great difficulty getting up onto her and then staying on her. Hours later, Wilkie and Weichert finally arrived back at the group's camp and found it plundered. The Nez Perce had taken horses, food, blankets, tents, and saddles, but not the guns. They had been broken and thrown into the fire. Wilkie and Weichert left almost immediately for the hot springs. Meanwhile, blood running down the side of his mare, Stewart eventually caught up with Stone, who, due to the pain in his leg, was making very slow progress. Stewart said he couldn't stay on his horse any longer and would have to walk. He asked Stone to stay with him and help him make it to Mammoth, and Stone agreed. They were a sorry picture and vulnerable, traveling now at an even slower glacial pace. But later, Wilkie and Weichert caught up. They helped Stewart and Stone onto their saddled horses, and the group finally arrived at McCartney's resort at Mammoth Hot Springs. This resort was really just a log cabin tucked into the Clematis Gulch right at the terraces. You can kind of see the terraces right here in the foreground to give you an idea of where it's at. Around 11, Duncan and then Dietrich also arrived at McCartney's. Wilkie, a trip leader, quickly left for Bozeman in order to fetch a surgeon and transportation for the injured. Weichert and James McCartney, the proprietor of McCartney's resort, set back out into the park to look for the missing men, while Duncan, the other trip leader, headed north in search of more immediate help in Paradise Valley at the ranches. Instead of leaving with Duncan, as he easily could have, Stone stayed behind to serve as a nurse for Stewart. The next day, help arrived to transport Stewart north, but Stone continued to stay behind. He wanted to be there in case the search party returned with anyone who was injured and needed help. Dietrich also did not leave. He was the music teacher. He had been the one to induce the young Roberts to go on this trip, and he couldn't bear the thought of facing Robert's mother without her son. Only Stone, Dietrich, and a man named Jake Stoner remained at McCartney's cabin. And Stone's selfless decision to stay nearly cost him his life over the next couple of days. And unfortunately, it did cost Dietrich his life. Later that day, Dietrich spotted two groups of about 40 men traveling their way. Thinking they might be more Nez Perce, the men fled the cabin in all directions. Stone cached himself in a gulch and waited, eventually spotting several Nez Perce getting closer and closer. Stone took off up the gulch, crashing through the timbers, and drew the attention of a Nez Perce man who gave chase. The man was relentless in his search for Stone. But incredibly, Stone found himself at the base of a tree with low branches. With what must have been incredible desperation, Stone got himself up and into that tree. The Nez Perce man came closer and closer and was baffled at not being able to locate Stone. Eventually, the man gave up and moved on. Stone, unwilling to risk discovery, stayed in the tree until after dark. In the years that followed this, people would question Stone's story and even publicly make fun of him in the newspapers about escaping via hiding up a tree. However, in 1878, Duncan MacDonald, who himself was half Scottish and half Nez Perce, interviewed Nez Perce survivors. One of the people he interviewed was the young Nez Perce man who chased Stone, and he confirmed the story's truth. Stone kept himself hidden away in the woods all the next day, and around 3 p.m., he heard an exchange of gunfire coming from the direction of McCartney's resort. After dark on that second day of hiding, Stone emerged from the woods and headed north, hiding himself away at the slightest sound. In the middle of the night, he came upon the cavalry camp of Lieutenants Gustave Doan and Charles Derudio. It's possible that Stone and Doan already knew each other because Doan had been on the 1870 Washburn expedition into Yellowstone. He was also a party of the Marias Massacre. With the assistance of about 25 Crow scouts, DeRudio and Doan's men had been looking for Stone and Dietrich specifically, knowing that they were still missing after having fled McCartney's resort. DeRudio broke the news to Stone that they had found Dietrich shot dead in the doorway of the cabin, his body still warm. This was the gunfire that Stone had heard earlier that afternoon. DeRudio, an Italian immigrant who 20 years earlier had been imprisoned for the attempted assassination of Napoleon III, joined the Union Army because of his disdain for slavery. He ultimately served as second lieutenant of the 2nd U.S. Colored Infantry Regiment, an all-black unit under the command of white officers. And when Stone showed up at their camp, DeRudio was particularly attentive to Stone. And despite being one of the 2 commanding officers of this group, he personally fetched food for Stone, who was then given a bed so he could lie down. Later that night, Weichert and McCartney arrived at the camp with the news that they had found and buried Charles Kenk's body back at the camp near Otter Creek. The next day, Stone traveled to Bottler's Ranch in Paradise Valley, where he was reunited with Stewart and Duncan. And on September 3rd, Stone, Duncan, traveled with Stewart to Bozeman, where they brought him to the Laclede Hotel, and doctors operated on Stewart's hip, removing pieces of shattered bone. Stone stayed in Bozeman with Stewart to act as nurse and companion. With Stone having so recently been bedridden, it's easy to imagine that he was better for caring than Stewart than most others might have been. A month after they arrived, Stone and Stewart were finally able to return home to Helena, where Stone was lionized by his friends. I also want to mention that 2 months after their ordeal in the park, Weichert returned to Yellowstone and retrieved the bodies of both Kenk and Dietrich, both of whom had been hastily buried. Alone, Weichert exhumed their bodies and brought them back on a wagon 200 miles back to Helena, where they were both given dignified burials. In the years after the summer of 1877, Stone continued to be a popular figure in Helena and later Fort Benton, where he lived for several years. He continued to go on extended fishing and hunting trips, including with his friend and employer, E.W. Toole, a well-known Montana lawyer. Stone also continued to be a leader in Helena's Black community, and his name pops up over and over in newspaper articles and elsewhere. In 1887, as the 15th territorial legislative session got underway in January, the House of Representatives elected Stone to serve as the House's watchman. Then, in late 1887 or early 1888, Stone moved to the tiny mining community of Wardner, Idaho, where he worked as a camp cook. This mine was owned by his long-term associate, Samuel Hauser, who had recently resigned as Montana Territory's governor so he could focus even more time on his personal businesses instead of government work. In early April, Stone became quite ill and was bedridden for several weeks. Towards the end of April, he sent a telegram to his old friend in Helena, E.W. Toole. Stone told his friend of his illness and his wish to return home to Helena. Toole quickly sent Stone funds for the journey and to pay for a nurse to accompany him home. Toole also made arrangements with a Black family in Helena, the Jacksons, to take Stone in and care for him while he recuperated. But Stone never made it home to Helena. He ended up in Sacred Heart Hospital in present-day Spokane, Washington, and on April 30th, 1888, Stone died in an unfamiliar city, hundreds of miles from his friends and the place he called home. His cause of death was listed as asthma, and he was about 57 years old. News of Stone's death made the papers all across the territory. He was not just a well-known man, he had been well-liked. One newspaper proclaimed that Stone would be remembered kindly by thousands of Montanans. The article went on, "Few people were more extensively known and more generally esteemed than Benjamin Stone. The bosom of many an old-timer will be filled with sorrow in the remembrance of his many amiable qualities and kind and generous deeds." Stone had been friends with at least 2 territorial governors. In Yellowstone, he helped save the life of Jack Stewart. He was one of the most prominent and influential members of Helena's Black community. And the friend he reached out to in his time of greatest need, Edwin Toole, was one of the most famous lawyers in Montana, and the next year, his brother would become the new state's first governor. Benjamin Stone never married, and he had no children. He was the last of his family's line. For a big-hearted man who is known for his humor and so well-liked, the end of Stone's story is a sad one. None of his connections or the warm regard he was held in was enough to provide him with dignity in death. Instead, despite being highly esteemed for his sterling qualities of head and heart by all who intimately knew him, no one was willing or able to take charge of his remains. Unlike his friends Dietrich and Kenk, Stone was not provided dignity in death. Instead, he was buried in an anonymous potter's field somewhere in Spokane with countless others of the destitute and unclaimed. He has no grave marker, and in fact, I've yet to identify the location of his remains. But the memory of Benjamin Stewart Stone should not be lost to history. And so today, I thank you for joining me in remembering this Helena pioneer, Benjamin Stone. Thank you.